I'm the director of adult programs here. Welcome to Writers and Books. If you're not familiar, we're a nonprofit literary arts center. We do classes, workshops, and we have our youth summer camps now open as well. Yeah, if you want to check out more, see our upcoming schedule, it's wav.org. There's also some flyers out in the hall you can grab. We're so happy to have Peter Connors tonight. First we'll hear him read from his new book, and then he'll be in conversation with Jonathan Everett. Jonathan Everett is a Rochester-based freelance writer and poet whose work has appeared or is forthcoming in Blaze Vox, Scarlet Leaf Review, Small Orange, Impossible Archetype, The Empty Closet, Lake Effect, and Moving Images Poetry Anthology, among others. He co-founded the long-running monthly open mic, New Ground Poetry Night at Equal Grounds Coffee House. Peter Connors' unique blend of prose poetry, flash fiction, and other spare poetic forms pays witness to the heart-wrenching, absurd, life-changing nature of surviving a global pandemic during one of the most politically and culturally divisive times in American history. Peter is the author of 10 books of poetry, fiction, and nonfiction, including the prose poetry collections Of Whiskey and Winter and The Crows Were Laughing in Their Trees. He also edited the groundbreaking prose poetry flash fiction anthology PPFF, an anthology, and was founding editor of Double Room, a journal of prose poetry and flash fiction. His nonfiction books, including Growing Up Dead, Jamaica, and White Hand Society, the psychedelic partnership of Timothy Leary and Allen Ginsberg, document music and countercultural communities. He lives in Rochester, New York, where he works as publisher and executive director of the award-winning independent publishing house, Bow Editions. Peter, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me, Dan. Appreciate it. And Allison and everybody at Writers and Books. Please silence your cell phones. All right. Dan, you tell me if it's okay on there and here. All right. So thanks everybody for coming. This is the first prose poetry collection that I've published in 10 years, and I was not writing. Hey, Andrew. I was not. I just wasn't. I've been writing nonfiction, really, is what it comes down to. And so the poetry that I've written in between then was just sort of for me, or I would give it to other people as a gift or something like that, or just, for my own journaling or whatever. And then, as happened to many people, I had some free time when the world got locked down. And I immediately I didn't have a nonfiction book project that I was working on, which I've had something for almost a decade. And so, not knowing exactly what to do with that time and not having a project, I just started to write prose poems. And it's the only form of poetry that I've published in. There's also pieces in here that are going to veer over into more of flash fiction things, so I don't really draw hard lines between those, but you're going to hear things that are more fiction-y, and you're going to go, that's not a poem, and you're right, it's not. That's okay. This used to be a jail, but we're not going to get thrown in it for doing that. Didn't it? Writers and Books used to be a jail, yeah. Anyway, so I found it to be, hey Anastasia, I found it to be a really great form for what we were experiencing, because it's often surreal. You can go to very strange places, you can make these big leaps, and the voices that you can conjure through prose poetry and through flash fiction felt very appropriate for what we were dealing with. So the book is called Beyond the Edge of Suffering. It's not a happy title or book, but there's happier pieces in here, and I think I'm going to read some of those because I'm just not in the mood to get so far down. And so that means some more of the flash pieces too, which tend to be more playful. So this first one I'm going to read is actually one of the last pieces that I wrote, and it's called Superhero. A superhero sheds teardrops large enough to drown evildoers. But really, who is he to judge? Sadly, after a promising early career, our hero hits a rough patch. The incredible callousness that citizens show each other every day hardens his tear ducts. Tears will no longer flow. Adaptation is life, thinks the hero, as he shoves his cape to the back of the closet, then pulls on an old sweatshirt and gym shorts. But what's the point? After years of weeping, crime is still ubiquitous, malfeasance as inevitable as the Dorito dust staining the remote control. Pondering this dismay, our hero points his remote at the evening news. Click. The channel changes, and the hate crime that has plagued his conscience goes away. There is shock and awe. He spills wildly from a podium. Point, click, gone. All the warning signs, but was ignored. Point, click, gone. A sex predator media mogul in a tearful bid for redemption. Point, click, gone. All the men, and they are all miraculous. Most importantly, it is effortless. Our superhero drapes his cape over his lap and refills his chip bowl. He is back in the game. He vows again to rid the world of crime. He will train with the same focus a corpse gives to stillness. Inaction will be action. He will ignore crime into non-existence. It is, he insists during the many interviews he grants, what the world demands. Insofar as such things are possible, our hero is reborn. The public is positively ensorcelled by this thrilling turn. They eat it up. On morning chat shows, they speculate that his incredibly potent ineffectuality must be supernatural in origin. It is the only explanation, willfully ignoring that his birth certificate clearly reads Rhode Island. No matter. The important point is that everyone is doing fine, wonderfully in fact, if you watch the right thing. But alas, the world being the world it insists on being, tragedy strikes. The story goes that one morning our superhero spills milk on his beige couch while solving a kidnapping in Nebraska. 1 week later, the fair-haired farm girl has been located, we assume, but it is too late for the milk. It has turned. The smell is repulsive, disgusting. Our superhero knows that measures must be taken. Sour milk cannot be left to spoil a room, nor spoiled milk left to sour a room. But what if, thinks our superhero, he simply carries the television into another room, perhaps even the bedroom? That way, he muses, he could solve crimes without getting out of bed. Performing heroics from beneath a fluffy quilt does have undeniable appeal, particularly on chilly mornings, and with some basic needlework, his cape could be turned into decorative throw pillows. As far as the crime-fighting thing, the bedroom would work just as well, he speculates, and the living room would probably take care of itself eventually, right? I mean, it would have to. Things can't just smell forever. Thus it is decided. Our superhero bends to lift the television, straining so hard a single teardrop forms in his right eye. So the way that this is structured is the first section is mainly like more COVID-y type poems, and then these ones are all clustered together into a section called A Story About It. And so this is from that section too, and this is How Simon Created God. God did not exist, so Simon decided to create him. Basing it on the earlier model, his first design was erected purely out of ideas. The A model was an omniscient multitasker. However, Simon's inability to comprehend the motives of its parallel processing skills stalled the project at the design phase. Dismayed but not deterred, A was scrapped. Work continued. On a liquid, clear autumn day, while Simon was raking leaves in his front yard, it hit him. Ideas, though suitably malleable, will never suffice. The new God must also be tangible. Spontaneous by nature, Simon began gathering leaves, twigs from the ash tree, a molding base of thick mud. Natural and tangible, that was the game. This prototype was successful, but ultimately decayed too fast to gain the legion following necessary to launch it as a deity. Failure number 2. The grant money dried up. Simon became depressed, indulged in a long-repressed shoe fetish. He smoked white owls and drank soda, cried incessantly into yellow tissues. His wife, a good-hearted person, suggested a female-based model. Simon snorted. His 9-year-old daughter, a scrappy doll, suggested a video game. Simon moved out. He took a room at the Super 8, morosely carrying on his research. Strangely enough, it was autumn again that finally inspired Simon to create Model C. Not the land necessarily, but the colors. The green grass, red berries, black squirrels, retreat of chlorophyll, slate sky, the fiery genesis of it all right there before him. So some of these too I should mention, and that was one of them. A long while back, I had a thing that I did with a painter named Steve Smock, who actually did this painting on the cover. He's done the paintings for all 3 of my poetry books. Really talented local painter. We had a collaboration that we did in city newspaper called Silence Underfoot. And he would have a piece of artwork and I would have one of these pieces. And in some cases I just had a piece that matched his artwork, and in some piece I actually wrote, and sometimes I just wrote the piece to match the artwork. And so I'm going to read you 2 now that actually I wrote to match his artwork. It's too bad. I wish I had it now to show you, but I don't. But it's actually online if you're ever curious, City Newspapers Archives. This one is called Fulfilled. I wish they still did that. You know, had any kind of creative writing in there. Anywhere in the city, for God's sakes. Anyway, Fulfilled.
Topic for another day.
Yeah, topic for another day. I digress. Anton and I grew up in a small periwinkle house with the highest house number in America. It was official, in the record books. Men with hats and cameras would come periodically to take our photograph in front of it and ask us what it was like living there, having to address letters and so forth. My father was a prissy man with lacquered fingernails. My mother smiled too much. All was well. In the photographs, we would hold each other, the number showing just over Anton's small shoulder, big, round, heavy numbers that went on and on. Copies of magazines and newspapers with our pictures in them would arrive from around the world. Anton took this to mean that he was an artist. He wore a cloak at 13. Nobody stopped him. He poured Fresca onto bowls of cereal. He peed on the garden and sometimes in the sink. He was special. My parents allowed Anton these observances, but our neighborhood would not. Anton was mocked and beaten. His cloak was torn to strips. He was made to eat rocks. His long ears were pulled. Local boys did not appreciate the arts. Anton passed the rocks painfully and went on believing. He never did paint nor sculpt. Anton never composed a symphony or a pop song or an opera, never wrote, danced, or sang. He moved to New York City. Artists flocked to his side. Their publications followed his presence. Anton's plans and statements were never to be missed. His dream was to walk 2 llamas the length of the Appalachian Trail. He would subsist on Skittles and orange juice for a year. Anton once organized a panel discussion called Artists Kneeling on Nukes, or Anon. The press turned out in many artists. Anton was the panel. He took the stage announcing that he would detonate small nuclear devices inside of his hands and knuckles, then commence cracking various joints and knuckles into the microphone. After a few minutes, Anton wrapped his dark Merlot cloak around himself and strode off to wild applause. He was an artist to the death. One autumn morning, they found him splayed across an abandoned field outside a housing project in the Bronx, face down. He jumped to live, the note said, not to die. They located his nails sparkling in the sun among the many bits of glass and metal, each one containing a single digit, but still not containing them all. And this one is called, Hello, My Name is Larry. I am a man of few bad habits, but those that I do have, I practice with zeal. Acquaintance, I don't know why that just cracked me. I just picture the name tag. All right, hello, my name is Larry. I'm a man of few bad habits, but those that I do have, I practice with zeal. Acquaintances may describe me as stunningly damaged. I am a home. I own a home. It is full of my possessions, tables and chairs and the like. I avoid other things. I have a picture window overlooking a yard that I own and all the grass on it. It is like my neighbors, but we are different. Both greenish-brown to brownish-green, though. I am 4 sport coats with matching slacks and 2 nice suits. There are shoes that I own. Most contain leather and laces. I had a bicycle once, but now own none. A Mazda. I own a Mazda that is paid for. It takes regular gas, and regular gas is what I give it. In my wallet are money, a button, 2 credit cards, a spare house key, a driver's license, and business cards that I am handed that are mine now. I make coffee, but seldom cake. I eat cake, but buy it in the store with other bread, meat, fish, dairy, fruit, and pasta in the grocery aisles. I take them home to my cupboards until I am ready for eating. That is usually 3 times a day, depending on the cake. Maybe 4 with cake. I am overweight. My wife is a shoe store manager who lives with my brother-in-law's best friend now, and even though it didn't work out, I'm not angry with her. I am smiling inside. I see who I please now, which is better than you may think. I imagine it will start soon. I will buy her flowers and a card, my new girlfriend, to show how deeply I care. Relationships are everything, it will say, and I will mean every word of it. I will clear some space in my closets and then ask her to place some clothing there depending on which season it is at the time. We will buy flowers together and plant them on Sunday after breakfast. Neighbors will walk by with appreciative smiles. Lair. She will brush my ankle and call me Lair. I will sigh and call her by her name, but shortened also. Months will pass, and when we are ready, I will show her my ceramic duck collection and ask her to marry me. What a happy day that will be. She will take my name, and we will live together in my house for many years to come. Our doormat will say, "Welcome all." Love story. Okay, so this is one called Insubordination. It happened again. You've been accused of insubordination. It's a recurring theme in your life, and you will never outgrow it. There will never be a time when you are not driven to acts of insubordination. You have a history, as they say. There is a track record. You only have yourself to blame. Your attitude has kept you in a position of subservience, and every so often you will be reminded of that by someone who really knows how to dress. You will both sense that you have a general disregard for authority. It will go without saying that you have a bad attitude. You will be in that position because you don't follow the rules. The laughable part, you will not be in on the joke, is that you may not even know how to go about learning the rules and then figuring out how to negotiate them towards some future goal. No one is interested in having you in a position of leadership anyway. A top-down management system based on insubordination would be doomed to failure for you and for whatever ill-fated venture you stumble into. The truth is that leadership would simply mean working that much harder to find people with whom to exercise your natural impulse toward insubordination. Which isn't to say there wouldn't always be someone above you. There would be. You would recognize them when they inevitably accuse you of insubordination. But with success, those people are harder to find, and once they invite you to play golf, you may even feel bad telling them to go fuck themselves. It happens. Your best attempts at remaining insubordinate can be subverted by a well-made Arnold Palmer in casual conversation. That's why it's best for you not to speak to anyone who may someday place you in a position of authority. It will ultimately be more trouble for you than it's worth. It's also inconsiderate to dupe authority figures into trusting you unless you truly plan on making the next step toward middle management and beyond. They are so innocent, these leaders working in defense of the natural order. They deserve better than duplicity. They deserve better than you. Okay, this is things to do with problems. So those are much more like sort of flash fiction-y pieces, and that one's almost like a monologue piece. And sometimes prose poems take the form of lists too. There's sort of different ways that people attack it, and sometimes fables. I'll read you one that's more fable-like. This one is more of a list prose poem. Things to do with problems. 1. Throw money at them, literally. Back up a dump truck full of gold bullion and unload it. Squash the problems flat. Or fill a sweat sock with pennies and smack the problems repeatedly until they stop being so problematic. 2. Medicate them. There are so many options available. Alcohol is readily available and socially acceptable, but there are far more pills than bottles of booze. Some people mix those together to make their problems go away forever, but then they are dead, and that seems boring. 3. Screw them. Imagine your problems as sexual partners and have intercourse with them. This is guaranteed to multiply your problems, but the same can be said for all of these techniques, and at least you'll be getting laid, right? 4. Meditate on them. This is a fancy way of saying trap yourself in a room with your problems and ruminate on them until you get hungry. Eventually, you'll think more about food than the original problems, which of course will be another problem, see above, but easier to deal with. Just go make a sandwich. 5. Ignore them. More will be along shortly. 6. Deal with them. Address the issues head-on with clarity, composure, intelligence, and maturity. Find the best available solutions and develop the resolve necessary to stand behind your decisions and manage their ramifications with equanimity. 7. Feed them to the squirrels. Those little fuckers will eat anything. Okay. And then here's a more fable-like one that has to start like all fables have to start. How do all fables have to start? What are the words? Huh? Once upon a time. Yeah. Once upon a time, there was a very large man who walked into a very small house. Or was it a very small man who walked into a very large house? For certain, there was a man and a house. He was larger than many things inside the house, smaller than others, but he did not hold that against the things because they were only things after all. This was a most reasonable man. He was not given to pointing out the shortcomings of such and thus. What is the point, thought the reasonable man, of falling in love? This was a reasonable question for a reasonable man to ask. In a world where some things are large and others small, what difference can one man's love make? There will always be things to make us feel feelings. The man was not immune to such things, feeling feelings. But what is the point, thought the thoughtful man, of such indulgence when there are driveways to be shoveled and the snow grows so deep? There was a thoughtful man standing waist deep in snow. He could not for the life of him remember how he got there, but he shoveled. He shoveled nonetheless. And this is a shorter one that I was actually on Evan Dawson's show Connections yesterday. It's such, I just want to say it's so great that I love his show, and I love the fact that he puts poetry on there and he puts, artists on there. And it's really such a special thing that we have here. And he interestingly picked out this one that he had zeroed in on, and he read it and asked about it. And so let me read it, and then I'll just tell you quickly about this piece. Okay. Love everyone, said the teacher. Always tell the truth. But I hate these people, yelled the student, pointing at his fellow students. And I hate myself, too. I thought I told you to love everyone, replied the teacher. But you told me to tell the truth, answered the student. The truth is, I don't love everyone. The teacher drew close, nose to nose, staring coolly at the student. Love everyone, he said, pulling hard on the student's ear. Always tell the truth. So this is one that I almost took verbatim from a story by a spiritual teacher named Ram Dass, who was In the introduction, you said that I'd written a book on Timothy Leary, and he was born with the name Richard Alpert, and he was an assistant of Timothy Leary's at Harvard during their psilocybin tests and their psychedelic testing. And he went on to have a really interesting life and career as a spiritual teacher, and followed many practices. But his guru was a Indian saint named Neem Karoli Baba, who challenged this extremely intellectual Harvard professor who overthought everything with the command, love everyone. And it completely short-circuited his whole brain because he wanted some sort of deeper teaching. He wanted something more tangible, something less difficult than love everyone and tell the truth all the time. And so I've always loved that story, and it's really I changed a little bit to make it flow, but that's kind of that story. So here's another short one. I have needs too, said the woman to the hat. The hat did not respond. I have needs too, she said to the cat. The cat raised, circled, and curled to sleep in the opposite direction. Excuse me, she said to the water flowing from the shower head. I have needs too. The water made her wet. She stepped from the shower, wrapped a towel around her head, and rubbed a clear oval into the mirror's steam. I have needs too, she said to the reflection. I want to tell you that I have needs too. The reflection studied her eyes, such a lovely shade of brown. Did you hear me? She said, staring into the brown eyes. I have needs too. I understand, replied the eyes, smiling back. Please tell me what you need. We are in this together. Here's a little love type one, I guess. Woo me with tedium, my love. Bathe me in the mundanity of your days. Allow me to savor the image of you scratching your nose, tapping your keyboard, sniffing an orange, transferring funds, ferrying socks from washer to dryer. Please don't tell me about your dreams, that unreliable shamble of the subconscious. I am tired of dreams. Instead, whisper to me of the seconds you spent debating whether to floss. Unspool the saga of the waxen thread, the slow slide through enamel crevasse, this solemn quest to dislodge some rebirth of wonder. And this is a title poem from this. How are we doing on time? Are we good? Yeah. A couple more? All right. I'll read this one and then I'll end with one that's a little more kapowy. This is another short one. The candle burns like this. Each drop of wax is a letter. Each letter is a moment. Each moment is a plea for tender mercy. The gray smoke whispers into your ear. May your heart, my love, never be bound too tight. The flames whisper into your throat. Each mystery inside of you will one day be revealed. The wax whispers into your flesh. What we long to hold quivers, naked, beyond the edge of suffering. And I think let me read just a couple. I've been avoiding the COVID poems, but I'll read you a couple of these, because what the hell. This is my mask poem. Like, I have a mask poem and a Zoom poem. The greatest hits, So this is my mask poem. Is your mask to hide or to protect? It was never a question until now. We wore masks to hide, to disguise, to steal, to conceal, to escape the toxic fallout of our worst impulses. Plus, there was the added bonus of implied invincibility. Say it with me now. Invincibility. It feels good, right? Just stretch the cloth across your mouth and breathe the bitter scent of your own exhalations. For a moment, you will believe it lasts forever. Our whole dumb history is such greedy pursuit. It is only one piece of fabric, though. It will only stretch so far. And I'll read you my Zoom poll. Okay. And we were all famous. We performed sketches called Meetings or Family Reunions or It's So Good to See You. And we laughed at the strangeness of the plot. There were wardrobe decisions, special lighting, camera angles, guest stars who made jokes about not wearing pants. It was very funny. The script worked every time. How we laughed, oh, we got along famously. In front of the cameras, at least. Behind the scenes, things were not so good. There was general concern that the production would need to shut down. There was rumbling and consternation. There were meltdowns, widespread malaise, copious technical difficulties, addiction issues, violence. There were demands that could never be met. Cast members felt that management had left the building. They were out to lunch. We were stars, yes, but where was the director of this Warholian tragicomedy? In front of the cameras, eyes scanning the monitor, we waited for the next line, waited for the plot to reveal itself. We twitched inside ourselves, anxious for someone to help or appear to care about us at all. Okay, and I'm going to end with two that are a little bit more like whiz-bang-y. Whatever that means. You'll hear it. Or not. Okay. The beaches are filled with bodies. The boardwalk is filled with bodies. The bodies are not filled with antibodies, and those are the bodies we worry about most. There are bodies in bags and freezer trucks outside mortuaries in New Jersey. There are bodies in front of cameras smiling wide enough to ignore 3,000 more bodies every day, 3,000 more bodies, 3,000 more bodies, 3,000 more bodies. There are bodies on television telling us to wear masks. There are bodies on television telling us don't wear masks. We need bodies to make money. They say we need bodies to make money. Human bodies packed together process animal bodies to grow oversized American bodies, and they call this progress. Brown bodies are killed. Brown bodies are beaten by blue bodies. There are small brown bodies in cages across the West and 1 million brown bodies locked in cages sea to shining sea. Marching bodies fill the streets despite the plague, screaming this is no way to live. There is the body politic. There is the body electric. Queer bodies, straight bodies, new bodies, disabled bodies, bodies sold, hungry bodies, bodies privileged, world-famous bodies, old bodies loved and forgotten. The graveyards are filled with bodies who could never be replaced. There is a body of knowledge, accessible to all, largely ignored. And this is the last one I'll read, and then Jonathan and I can talk a little bit about life. This is called Welcome to the Last Day of America. Welcome to the last day of America. Don't be shy, there are plenty of seats up front. It is duller than we expected, but there are party balloons and red hats, so shut up and enjoy. Believe in the white old days, we'll get back there. Clear the decks, fill the prisons, pile silver trays with towers of greasy wrapped hamburgers, and build walls higher than any 10,000 children could scale. Break the children, break them, break the mountains, break the sky. It has been spoken that every creeping thing that creepeth is thine dominion, America, so fuck it up real good. The future is yours, more or less. Not necessarily yours per se, but did we mention the balloons? Once inside, the line forms on the left until you reach the front, at which point it switches to the right, constantly. We regret to inform you that our capacity has been reached. You don't have to go home, but you can't stay here. Don't worry. Our capacity may be low, but our light shines brighter than ever, blah, blah, blah. Here, have some tokens. If you don't mind a little friendly advice, Never trust the hand that bites you. Once retracted, it will do it again. I mean, it's not as if you didn't see it coming, America. The orange fox was in the hen house, but you only stared dumbly. You did nothing. Now bend over and kiss your purple-fruited asses goodbye. Want to talk?
Yeah.
You got note cards. Oh shit.
No, I have a folded
Oh, okay.
program.
All right. I'm not as intimidated.
This is it.
All right. Color of eyes.
Yeah.
Favorite food.
Nice job.
Thank you.
This is a beautiful collection. It was interesting that you read some pieces from a collaboration with Steve Smock.
Yeah.
And I know you've known him for years, and you've had, his art has been featured on all of your books, all of your poetry collections. And I noticed that with the pieces that you read from that, they go back a few years.
Yeah.
And then I was listening to some of the more recent ones, the last ones you read about COVID times. And it struck me that some of that earlier work has more whimsy, some of the later work has more clarity. And I wonder if you see that in yourself as an evolution of who you are as a poet, because that represents a span of time of a number of years.
Yeah, I like that question. I think some of the earlier ones, those flash pieces, I had a sort of a method where I would jot down random things, like some of the things that Anton was doing about, walking llamas the length of the Appalachian Trail, which a friend of mine who was high all the time really wanted to do with his llamas. And, the stuff with Skittles or Fresca or whatever. And so I would sort of accumulate, these different things, and then my challenge to myself was how to work them into a single piece. So that was an actual approach, and it worked really well with Steve's stuff in particular, because at that time he really tended to focus on an individual figure, and it was a really distinctive looking, just single figure that would take up the whole frame. And so there was a lot to imagine what this person, might be like and might be thinking, and it gave me a lot of room to sort of work those pieces in there. And I don't do that anymore, you know what I mean? So I'm sure that first line, my friends may describe me as stunningly damaged. It's like just a line and then you work it in. But the COVID pieces in the first part of this were very much came, all of a piece as a poem in itself. And I will tell you, I really, once they started to come, they just, the form made a lot of sense, for what was not making a lot of sense, in the world. And then what I realized is I didn't want to have a whole collection of just those, but they set up a certain tone, which is reflected, I think, in the book's title, that lent themselves to going back to some of these pieces that I'd never put into a collection, and going oh, they fit, the tone of this collection, they fit the sort of style, they fit a mentality that is absurd, that is tragic, that is beyond the edge of suffering,
Yeah.
So that's why they ended up in there, because I just sort of felt, I'd wanted to put them into a collection before, and they just didn't quite fit with anything, and they felt like they really fit in here.
So, not every book, not every collection of poetry has a title poem.
Yeah.
This one does. They often do. And in this case, did the title spring from a poem that you wrote, and you, as it was starting to come together, you thought, this is the title, or your editor discovered that? Or did you have that title in mind and then write something to it?
No, that was already in a poem, and it was just the end of that poem.
Yep.
And it really did come towards the end. This was a poem that I had probably reworked over 7 or 8 years in different forms, and I had written it as a lineated poem, this is actually the first time I'd written it as a prose poem, and I cut out, a bunch of what was in it, and I just sort of got down to the real essence of what it was. And as soon as I had, that last line and placed it into the collection, it just seemed like, okay, this is what it is. And I will say, people have asked me, and I've gone back and forth about what Beyond the Edge of Suffering means. And in my optimistic times, I think beyond the edge, now we're into the next thing. And in my other times, I think, I've been pushed beyond the edge of suffering.
Yeah, I've wondered about that too.
Yeah.
Is it worse than suffering or past suffering?
Yeah, and the answer is yes.
Yes.
I mean, that's
Mm-hmm.
So and
Sometimes.
And this is why I like it as a title. I mean, it's because it sort of depends on what's going on, and it works both ways, and they're all true.
Yeah.
So.
Speaking of titles, I'm interested in how you how titles play into your poetry, and how important is titling to you. I think that I've talked to people about how sometimes you scan a table of contents and you can get a sense of the tone of a collection just from the titles. I've talked to, it seems like sometimes they're treated like a sort of as an afterthought. How do you approach titles?
This is the first collection that the whole first section doesn't have any proper titles. I just use like the first few words of the piece as the title. And that was again, I hadn't done it, but that was, to me, those pieces are all, they hang together so much that I didn't want to break them out with a specific title. And I did that, I think maybe in other sections too, but I really, because I do think titles are really important, and I think they really distinguish a piece. They set up expectations for a piece. They are often, can serve as the first line of a piece, right? Like that, even I'll go back to like, hello, my name is Larry. That is the title of the piece, but in a lot of ways it's really an important starting place, for that poem as well. So I think that they are incredibly powerful. I think they're really important. And I think, in this case, my solution to sort of take them out of the equation and stay with the poems themselves was to just not have a proper title,
People often make a distinction between the poet, the speaker, the voice. With this collection, what made me think of this is the Larry poem. Do you see most of these as are you putting the speaker and the poet in the same place, or do you feel like in most cases with these poems, the speaker is someone who you're channeling as the poet?
I don't think I'm that clever.
No. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think I will say I don't.
Well,
mean
there are
that to be.
personas.
Yeah.
Sure.
I think it's I'll I mean, maybe because I move between like fiction and poetry and nonfiction or whatever, that I don't have any problem just writing in a different voice or writing from a different perspective that's not mine, or inhabiting, what I mean, a character, which I think, in poetry isn't as common. In prose poetry is a little more common. So I think in that way, like, and I'm talking about, hello, my name is Larry, like I'm Larry, you know what I mean? That is where I'm coming from, and I sort of get inside that head. At the same time, those turns of phrase or the little like bits of humor or whatever will appear in other places, that is my own voice or style or whatever. Maybe I'm Larry.
I don't think you're Larry. I don't know.
There's a sobering thought.
Well, I did notice that in Larry, about halfway through Larry, you go from present to future tense. So
Yeah.
Maybe you need to go back and take a look at like what you've predicted for yourself. I've got one more question, then I'll see if anybody else in the audience has any. But I just saw some breaking news about your archive with University of Rochester, and I don't even know that much about it. I just saw a headline and a lead. So can you talk about that a little?
Sure, yeah.
What's up with that?
So really, when I first got into writing and was gonna, knew that this was something I wanted to do. So I'm gonna say like 30 years ago or so, somebody said to me, you should save your papers. And I didn't really even know what that meant necessarily, but they, what they were saying is save your drafts, save your correspondence, save your journals, save all those things. And I did, without even really clearly knowing like why or what, but I did. I started to do that, and I've moved so many times over the years, and I would move these things with me, and then the containers got bigger, and they turned into like these big Rubbermaid, things. And as I would do a book, I would save all the things related to that book, and they would go in the archive. They would go in my bins. And if I put together this prose poetry flash fiction anthology at one point, and there was a whole lot of correspondence related to that with different poets, and there were drafts of it and all this stuff. I've also written 6 or 7 books and novels that never got published, that were this is how I learned how to write. I would just write books. That was my MFA program. I would write a book and read, and so those are in there. And so basically I just, and then as books have gotten published, same thing, correspondence, drafts of them, corrected proofs, all these different things. And so I've been doing that for 30 years. And I even have stuff going back to like things that I'd written when I was like 7 or 8. I just tossed them in there, you know what I mean? They turned up. So a few, I don't know how long it was to go, 7 or 8 months or something like that. I had so much stuff, it just got to be like too much, and I had to do something with it. So I reached out to University of Rochester Special Collections, and I said, I have all these things I've been saving. Along in there is also like a lot of zines, like so side stapled zines, stuff from the 80s and 90s. And when I first started writing, these crazy little, Xerox mimeograph zines from all over. And I would have a poem, in there. And it would also be like a Charles Bukowski poem in there, or a Peter Orlovsky, or whatever. These guys were still sort of in the mix there too. And really, that's how I started publishing. Is that I would do these things, and then an editor the editor Driver's Side Airbag out of Los Angeles would tell me that I should send a poem to the driver of Larry's Left Toe in like Detroit, and I'd be like, okay, and I'd send that to Larry, and then I had that correspondence. You know what I mean? So there is a whole history of zine publishing, of what that sort of underground poetry publishing scene was at that time. That's how I got into writing. So that's all in there too, and all the zines and all that stuff. So they came and looked at it and went through all the bins and all that stuff, and then they went back and they did deliberations and conversations, and I don't know what they did, but eventually they reached back out to me and they said, we would like to acquire your archives.
Awesome.
For U of R, and it's going to be the Peter Connors Literary Archive.
That's amazing.
So they did that. So they picked it up and started. And I know they're going to digitize it, and they're going to put it all online,
man.
and so.
I've seen Lucille Clifton's.
Yeah.
I've been up to Rush Reed's and looked through her stuff.
Yeah.
And it is so cool.
Yeah. So I will say, like, my own personal, experiences when I was traveling around. I had a friend who was at Stanford Law School, and then I was driving around in a pickup truck at that time a lot across the country, back and forth. And I went to stay with him, and I got him to sign me in to see Allen Ginsberg's papers. And just for the hell of it, just because I was curious. And so I started going through Allen Ginsberg's papers, and what I started to notice was this correspondence with Timothy Leary that I was very familiar with both figures. I did not know their connection at all. And so I started to get really interested in that, and then eventually I went and I got Stanford to send me a bunch of the correspondence, and I went around to all the Berg collection in New York and all these different special collections libraries, and that's why I ended up writing White Hand Society about the relationship between Ginsberg and Leary. So I firsthand had a lot of experience with, this is why archives are important, you know what I mean? And I do believe that. I do believe they're important, and I think I saved these paper things now that are like, people don't really save these paper things, so I don't know. I think there's
do you save correspondence, like electronic correspondence? Would that go into an archive like this?
I did.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So
I used to save
since
a lot.
People don't writers might not exchange handwritten letters anymore, but if you have emails that might have some significance, something like that would go in.
Yeah, and I know that they want to start saving they want me to figure out how to start saving my digital things for the future, and I don't really know how to do that, but they said they would walk me through it. But I will say, when I was doing that book, I also saw that Timothy Leary's archives were in a warehouse and not being taken care of. They were not accessible to the public. They were disorganized. There was a lot of fighting about them. And I thought, I'm trying to write this book, and I couldn't get access to Timothy Leary's archives because of this bullshit that was going on. And I thought it was really a travesty. And so during the promotion of that book, I went and gave a talk at the Berg, and the director of that collection came, and within 6 months, the Berg had acquired the Timothy Leary archives. And so I'm not going to say like it's because of me, but I was really pissed about it. And I was unhappy with Timothy Leary's people that they had allowed that to happen. So, yeah. So I think I think special collections are important, and I think there's a lot of ties that have nothing to do with me that are in those papers that will be of interest to people, just because of the times that I happen to live through and be participating in.
It's exciting. Anybody have any questions? Just raise your hand.
Quick question on process.
Yeah.
Obviously, we've all lived through the whole COVID. I'm curious to what your writing process was before the COVID time hit,
Yeah.
and during COVID time, and possibly how it changed your writing process as you see it going forward. Not that we're through COVID yet,
Yeah.
but still something changes the result from that.
Well,
Peter, before you answer
yeah.
that, just for the microphone, the question was, what was Peter's work process before the pandemic, and what was it like during and now?
Yeah, so I tend to focus on a project at a time, and once I get into a project, like I'll do it, and I'm super anal, and I won't stop until it's done one way or another, and I don't do really anything else of my own writing outside of that until that one's done, and that's worked really well for nonfiction. I had written a nonfiction proposal that I thought was very good, that did not get picked up, and my agent couldn't sell it or anything like that, and I was pretty discouraged by that, and it was right around when COVID hit. And so I was in between things, basically, and that's when I started to write prose poetry again. And really what it came down to is I realized that I had been in a mode of selling books, like selling my books and writing something on a proposal and then having to finish it and all this stuff. And I had to break out of that mindset to write poetry again, because I didn't know if it was going to get published, and it doesn't matter if it gets published because nobody's making any money off it anyway. You know what I mean? Like, so whoever likes it, whoever doesn't, I don't care, you know what I mean? Whatever. And so that was good. That was really healthy for me because it reconnected me with my original form of writing that I loved the most. And I've always considered myself a poet first because of the attention that I pay to language, no matter what I'm doing, you know what I mean? So that's poetry, So it didn't really change my, this is how I approach things, but it did change what I was working on. And I think it sort of loosened me up a little bit and broke me into a different way of looking at the thing that I loved, The other thing I did was go back and pull out a novel manuscript that I had first started over 20 years ago, and that I'd written in different forms over the years and put it away and picked it up and put it down. And I think I wrote it as a young adult novel at one point and tried that, and I just it never quite took off, it never quite worked, but I really liked the premise of it. And the premise is, what if a band with a cult following, what if it was an actual cult? And there were murders going on, along with this band's tour and all this stuff. And I really liked that idea. And so I said, I've written, 6 or 7 novels that I just left behind and just, whatever, that was the learning process. But this one I didn't want to leave behind. So I revisited that during COVID, and I really worked on it. I worked on it with my editor at Cornell University Press for a bit, and they didn't like it because it was a sex, drugs, rock and roll murder book, and that's not really Cornell University Press. So I found a press out of San Francisco called Manic D that's a really cool independent press that's really edgy, and they've been around for a long time. They do a lot of punk rock books and music books, and she loved it. She got it right away, Jen, who founded Manic D. And so that book comes out in May. And that was another thing that I did, you know, that was like, okay, like let me see if I can finally do this project. And then since then, I took the lead character who runs the cult in that book. This is going to get a little into the weeds, but the book is first person. Okay, so it's told through the perspective of somebody who's a roadie for that band. There's a cult leader in there who's really interesting, who only gets a little attention because it's first person and you can't really get into his brain. So now I've written and completed a novel that is about the origins of that cult, and it's third person. So now I'm trying to shop that around.
What kind of trilogy?
Yeah, it's a duology now, but maybe a trilogy. Yeah, yeah. So.
Anybody? Oh, Allison?
Yeah, I hope I'm remembering this right, but I think at one point you said something about the times we're in, and I picked up this idea of sort of fracture and disorder. And I know that I still experience time in a very different way. Is somehow all of the discipline and structure kind of exploded.
Yeah.
And in fact, sometimes, I guess what I'm getting at is, you also talked about the process of, kind of keeping this bone pile of phrases and, found words. And I'm wondering if that kind of liminal space or that mental environment encouraged you in putting disparate things into the space of one prose poem, because I feel like that's one of the things that entertains me about these. I love those juxtapositions and those mini leaps, and that the chronology is scrambled, and even sort of the point of view sometimes, even though the narrative voice doesn't shift.
Yeah.
And I just wondered if there was something about this very strange time that we're in that gave you permission to approach the work in that way, or did I completely miss what you were saying and I'm just filling it in?
No, you didn't. I mean, I think that is the, again, like that is one of the cool things about prose poems, you know what I mean? You can really make these, there is a lot of permission to make sort of absurdist comments, statements, leaps, break logic. And, one of the things I like about prose poems is if you give it to somebody who doesn't know poetry or might be intimidated by poetry, they're reading a poem before they even know they are, because it looks like, an article, or it looks like a paragraph or whatever, and all of a sudden they're reading it and they're like, what's going on? And I like that. There's a subversiveness to that, and so, yeah, I think it's more than anything, more than my approach to writing them, I think it's a form that allowed itself to do that. And I think the fact that, prose poetry allows for fables, and it allows for list poems, and it, allows for, taking the form of like writing a letter to somebody, you know what I mean, or whatever. There's so many different ways, or embodying a completely different persona, having a character or whatever. There were just so many different ways you can go about it. So I really like that flexibility too, and it did fit for these times, I mean, we were all in this mode of like, I would get up and go down to this little room, and that was my office for the day, and then when I turned off the computer, like, there was the TV, and I guess that was the nighttime thing, and there was, everything was all in the same place,
Well, also just sonically, some of them really interest me, and some of the internal, actually the meter, if you're actually writing the meter sometimes.
Yeah.
And I just love that, and the surprise of that, and the joy of that.
Oh, good, thank you. Yeah, I think I think of it in terms of a rhythm, but a meter is, it's all the same thing, right? Yeah.
I picked up on that too. And the other thing about prose poems I think that is interesting is, I mean, all poems have a shape. So do prose poems. It's just that the shape is very stark.
Yeah.
There's no entry point but the first word. You don't look at the page and see, a sculpture or stanzas or anything. That's one of the interesting thing about. I've never really thought about the shape of a prose poem, but it has a shape of its own.
Yeah, and I think the repetition can become really important in a prose poem, because again, you're not having line breaks, so the repeating of certain phrases or whatever, they can accrue meaning or power.
And there's more
or
surprise.
gather
Yeah.
absurdity or surprise. You know, it's like
Absolutely.
you say, it's like when you say the same word, you know,
Yeah.
napkin, napkin, napkin. You say it over and over, and it loses
Insubordination.
all insubordination. Yeah, it loses all meaning. You're like, what? I don't even know what this word means anymore. You know, so you can just sort of play with that repetition, and also the length, the line length. You know what I mean? So
Yep.
you have 3 words, and then you have 6 words, and then you have like a full sentence, then you have 1 word again, and that's the rhythm too that you set up.
There's so much possibility in it.
Yeah.
Anybody else? Dan?
We have a question from online.
Okay.
Sean says, I find this a subversively spiritual book. Can you talk just a little bit about that and the role that story has in helping us find, or is it feel, and what might be beyond the edge of suffering?
I'm not sure if I can repeat all of that.
Yeah, could you?
The comment on the subversively spiritual nature of the book.
The subversively spiritual nature of the book. What else?
And the role that story has in helping us find what might be beyond this edge of suffering.
The role that story plays in helping you find what might be beyond the edge of suffering.
Yeah, I have no idea what's
That's-
beyond the edge of suffering.
That's heady.
I don't know.
Yeah, that's heavy.
I really like the phrase subversive spirituality, though. I'm like, you know, I'm kind of hung up on that. You know, I'm like, oh, that's such a good line. I don't. That's such a, and it's what a packed, you know, concept.
Mhm.
You know, spirituality being subversive.
Book title.
Yeah. So I'm more like meditating on, you know, that, I guess,
Yeah.
that is an idea and as a question, like, okay, you just kind of blew my mind. Is spirituality subversive? I don't know, you know, but I will say that there's much more spirituality. I didn't have spirituality in any of my earlier books, and I didn't have it in any poems, and I didn't have it really as part of my life because I was raised as an altar boy. So, you know, I ran the hell away from that. And then in recent years have returned to a spirituality and a spiritual practice that has become really important and central to my life. And that made its way into this. And even things like talking about God, you know, whatever God might be, and I have my own version of that, but that was something that I would never have uttered, you know, before, because I had this hang up about where I had come from and what God meant in that context, and it's completely different for me now. And is that subversive? I guess the spirituality that I am sort of drawn to now, or that I practice in contemporary society, might be considered more subversive, but at the same time, it's also become much more mainstream. So I don't, you know, I will say safely that, you know, that is more a part of my practice now. And one of the things that I've learned over time is that it's always been a part of the lineage that I come from, as far as the counterculture, as far as beats, as far as even, you know, the Grateful Dead scene or whatever. It's always been laced with a spirituality that I wasn't aware of, and that I've become more aware of since then. And it is linked to, you know, bringing Eastern practices to the United States, and how those have gotten seeded and become a part of our culture now, so that we now have mindfulness, you know, meditation in elementary schools and all these things. I have a great group of people recovering from addiction that I go to every Wednesday called Recovery Dharma. And if you're interested at all in these things, I would encourage you to go to that group. And it's a meditation group, and it's a Buddhist-centered recovery group. And so, you know, I've connected with a lot of different practices that have helped me along the way, and that do make their way into my writing. And I hope that's subversive, because we need subversion always.
Love all people.
Love everybody.
I mean, and the backstory, a little subversive. I mean,
yeah. Well,
telling a professor that broke his brain, right?
Yeah.
In so many words. I remember the backstory that you were providing.
Yeah.
It's like that's not easy advice.
And this is, you know, this is the interesting thing, is that I wrote about this person before I even knew that he had become a spiritual teacher. And now I'm much more interested in him as a spiritual teacher than I am as him as a, you know, Harvard professor who was studying psychedelics. But I'd already written a whole book that this guy was central in. You know what I mean? So this is when I go like, oh, there's a whole, you know, veil that got pulled back on a culture that I've been a part of, that I wasn't tapped into that level of it. That has really broadened my thinking, you know?
Yeah.
And my art, you know, my willingness to take chances in certain areas, talking about things like love or talking about God or talking about spirit, you know, whatever.
Very cool. How are we doing on time?
I think we time for one more.
One more question? Anybody?
Favorite food, lobster.
Well,
Favorite color, purple.
well, just to wrap up, I guess, thanks for doing this and for reading. Congratulations on the book and the archive at U of R. It's an exciting collection and timely, and I think that it captures a mood that continues. And so, even though it's been a few years in the making, it's something that really resonates right now going forward. So, any closing thoughts?
No, thank you very much for your
Thank you.
questions. Thank you all for coming. I appreciate it.